everyone. For those of you who don't know, I'm sort of Grant Stark from HSE's Chemicals Regulation Division, and we're the central government body that's responsible for the regulation of pesticides here in the UK. I'm going to give you this morning a bit of a legislative and policy feel for the sort of area that we're working in here, and some of the pressures for change in the way that policy or how legislation might develop over the course of the next few years. Just want to join my colleagues in welcoming you all to the event. It's good to see so many folks turning out, and it's the opportunity for us to spread the message on responsible and sustainable pesticide use is a very welcome one. Say a few words on the Amenity Forum. For us in government, it's a very important organisation. Government doesn't feel that we can deliver responsible or sustainable pesticide use on our own. It's got to be done in conjunction with you guys who work in the industry, or you're responsible for pest, weed and disease control management. So it's very much a collective effort. And we see the Amenity Forum as having a very key role there, particularly in translating a lot of the policy messages that we in government want to give to the stakeholders or folks that are affected by pesticide use out there, much better at explaining these sorts of things in the terms that mean things to you guys who operate the system. And the Amenity Forum has been a very good advocate for the amenity sector within government. I think it's fair to say when I started 10, 15 years ago working in this area, there was a pretty poor appreciation of the sort of contribution that amenity, pesticide use, control of pests, weeds and diseases made to the well-being of society. And as a result of the efforts of John, his team and their predecessors, you can take it as read that there's a pretty good understanding right to very senior levels in government now of the contribution that you guys all make to a much more safer and much more prosperous society. So today we're looking at change, and I think it's a bit of a cliche, but change is the only constant. But in terms of pesticide regulation, control of pests, weeds and diseases, we are now entering a period of pretty unprecedented change. And so events such as this and plugging yourselves into mechanisms such as the Amenity Forum that will enable you to keep up to date with that change is probably now more important than ever. And we'll look later on at some of the pressures for this change. It's coming at a political level, the environmental change. You've got social pressures, technological developments, the legal environment's changing, and of course the economic situation is changing. So all of these elements coming together are driving change. And I think by virtue of you being here today, you're in a position to better understand the nature of that change and how it might affect your individual operation. Have a think about what the implications might be and how you could address to mitigate. Old style, John.
I'm making no comment.
Okay, so change is coming. But before we look at change, I'll just have a bit of a backward look, because I think to understand change and how it affects you, you need to have an understanding of how pesticides are authorised, how pest, weed and disease control is looked at. And apologies to those of you who have sat through this slide before, but it is a very necessary recap for folks. The basis of pesticide legislation is about ensuring the safe use of pesticides, and that's fundamentally what the system is all about. And a pesticide product is made up of a soup of chemicals, and some of the chemicals that are in there can have fairly undesirable properties. So the purpose of the pesticide regulatory regime is to identify those hazardous properties and then look to see if the exposure of people or the environment can be managed in such a way as to ensure that the hazardous effects don't manifest themselves in terms of any adverse effects on either the environment or people. So it's about controlling exposures. If we can't control exposures adequately, pesticides don't get approved. So that's fundamentally how the system is geared up. Now, we as a government, of course, we recognise that responsible, judicious use of pesticides can actually afford quite a lot of benefits for a modern society. So we look to facilitate safe and responsible pesticide use wherever we can. But it never trumps that overriding aim of ensuring safe and responsible use. And what you see here on this slide is essentially the three parts of the sort of the regulatory regime for sort of pesticides. And probably the bit where most effort or energy goes in is that sort of first bullet there, what we call the sort of the pre-market authorization stage. Basically, any sort of pesticide that you use or your contractors use has gone through an authorization process. That's done at sort of two levels. It's essentially a sort of European sort of regime. So the key chemical and the sort of super chemicals that make up a pesticide product, the thing known as the active ingredient, these are approved at a European level under a European system. And there's a vast amount of data assessed to check that a representative use of a sort of pesticide product containing this active ingredient can be used in a way that's not going to have, not going to cause harm to human health or have unacceptable effects on the environment. And once the active substance gets the OK at European level, member state authorities such as HSE are then charged with looking at individual product approvals. So you've got active substances such as sort of glyphosate being approved at European level, and then you get HSE looking at products such as sort of Roundup that contain the active substance. And so the European regime is acknowledged to be the toughest on the planet. Basically, you can get something through the European regime, get approval for an active substance in Europe, authorization for a product in a European country, virtually guarantee it would get through any other sort of system on the planet. The European system is recognised to be very precautionary and a very tough one to get through. So that's the pre-marketing authorization, the first sort of stage of the program. A lot of the effort that goes into pesticide regulation is done at that stage. Next stage concerns sort of controls and use, and this is what we'll be sort of talking about today. And obviously, once the product has been authorised and put on the market, we need to make sure it's being used in a way that's compatible with the sorts of assumptions on use that are made under the pre-marketing and authorisation stage. And so there are various bits of sort of European and national legislation that seek to ensure that pesticides are being used responsibly and safely. And here in the UK, we've got a fairly sort of straightforward sort of legislative regime in sort of some ways. There's some very sort of simple and easy to understand sort of requirements when it comes to sort of use of pesticides. Follow the details that are on the product label very carefully, never deviate from that. If you're a pesticide user using a product, sort of make sure that you hold the relevant sort of qualifications that enable you to apply the product. It's a new requirement that applies to a relatively new requirement that applies to everybody that's operating in the sector. And there's also a requirement that certain types of application equipment need to be tested on a regular basis. And the very sort of rough rule of thumb is if you sort of ride around on something, it needs to be tested. But as I say, if you want sort of details on more sort of specialist types of equipment, we can sort of explore that in either sort of questions or later. So a reference on the slide here to some more of the more sort of challenging sort of legal requirements that exist within the sort of legislation. A couple of requirements in there is probably worth drawing your attention to. Firstly, there's a requirement anybody who uses pesticides, for example, in the amenity area, needs to ensure that the use is minimised. And the second one is that folks need to take sort of reasonable precautions to protect human health and the environment when they're using or storing sort of pesticides. So the obvious sort of question is, well, what do you mean by minimise use? What do you mean by taking sort of reasonable precautions? And the answer is that there isn't an easy answer to it. It depends very much on circumstances. And the government has published sort of a code of practice on safe pesticide use. The Amenity Forum has got a lot of guidance on what would constitute reasonable or safe or sustainable practice in different sort of situations. It's very sort of useful sort of mechanisms or tools out there. You've got the Basis Amenity sort of training register. You've got the Amenity assurance schemes that sort of provide sort of frameworks or access to advice that will enable you to sort of show if there was an incident, for example, when HSE inspectors came calling or an insurance company sort of asked for sort of details of how you were following the law. If you're sort of members of these sorts of schemes, that puts you in a pretty good position to show that you've demonstrated, or allows you to demonstrate that you've exercised sort of due diligence in assembling the sort of information that is needed to meet your legal requirements. So we would sort of advocate sort of membership of the likes of the Amenity Training Register of Amenity Assured and its equivalents. Now it's here that this sort of document that was sort of referred to in the title of the presentation, the National Action Plan, comes into play. I say this at all these meetings. I wrote the National Action Plan. I wouldn't advocate you go away and read it. It's something that we in government are required to produce as a result of an EU directive on sustainable pesticide use. It basically sets out how the government is going to deliver sustainable pesticide use in the UK. And you'll see here it covers a number of different areas: the training of operators, how we control sales, the testing of equipment, what sorts of measures you might take to protect amenity in sort of conservation areas, handling and storage practice, and IPM, or integrated pest management, which John referred to earlier and which we'll sort of return to later in this talk. Now, the UK sort of National Action Plan sort of picks up on that theme that I mentioned earlier. This is not about sort of government just imposing sort of legislation to deliver safe and responsible pesticide use. It's sort of using legislation as part of a suite of sort of measures and sort of mechanisms to deliver the sorts of outcomes that this European directive is looking for. Now, the National Action Plan itself is very much what we call the sort of living document. There's an expectation that pesticide use becomes more sustainable as time evolves, and we expect to see the National Action Plan evolving over time to reflect this. Now, DEFRA, in the wake of EU exit, or impending EU exit, are intending to run a wider sort of review of pesticide policy towards the end of this year. And I think as a result of that, we may see sort of changes to the National Action Plan in the longer term. But you as sort of individuals who sort of operate in this sector, you could be affected by the sort of thinking that comes out of the National Action Plan review. Need to be aware of some of the pressures and possible sort of direction of travel. And just for completeness here, the final sort of stage of this sort of three-part sort of process for regulating pesticides is monitoring impacts. So we look at sort of pesticide residues in foodstuffs, how they're turning up in water as a result, say, of Environment Agency monitoring. Let's try to get a sort of handle on patterns of pesticide use on sort of key crops and in key situations, and the practice of pesticide users. And that sort of enables us to determine whether the products are actually sort of behaving once they're released into the environment in the way that we thought they would do when the pre-market and authorisation work was being done. What I would say on the monitoring of impacts is, in agriculture, we think we've got a pretty good handle on what's going on. We know the number of sort of farmers that are out there that are likely to be using pesticides. We know how many bits of equipment are out there that need testing. We just haven't got that level of sort of detail or knowledge in the amenity sector. So a sort of plea I would sort of make to you guys as the sort of influential sort of players in the sector is engage, help government, help the Amenity Forum to understand numbers in your sort of sector. How many folks are engaging with the training programs? How many are engaging in continuing professional development? Is all the machinery being tested that it should? And so the government does run a sort of regular sort of survey of sort of practice in the sector, but uptake hasn't been that sort of great in the past. So if there's anything you can do to influence that, that'd be very much sort of appreciated by all of us, both in government and the Amenity Forum. Okay, on to the pressures for sort of change, and so there's sort of four sort of key areas. Certainly the bottom one, I imagine, is sort of very sort of familiar and sort of obvious to everybody in this room, but I'll sort of run through some of the others before we get there. In some ways, it may be sort of less important, strangely enough. First one is sort of the political, social, and legal environment. And when I sort of started off in this game, sort of 25, 26 sort of years ago, it was all about the sort of the science. If the science said this particular use of a pesticide is safe, off it would go through the system. You could bet your mortgage that was going to be the regulatory decision that was taken at the end of the day. About 10 years ago, it started to become more of a political issue. And you had a sort of system that is certainly more sort of receptive to political lobbying. don't think we've necessarily seen any sort of decisions being changed as a result of that, but processes that you thought were necessary, that were pretty sort of straightforward 10, 15 years ago, are becoming much more involved and tricky. And sort of glyphosate was a classic example of that, where the science was pretty much sort of settled at European level. It met all the criteria to enable the pesticide to be approved. 10 years ago, nobody would have batted an eyelid when it went through. But there was a campaign of sort of political lobbying against sort of glyphosate, and that continues to that day. And that was sort of reflected in the conditions that were attached to sort of glyphosate getting its approval at a European level. So it has an influence, and it's something that you guys operate in the sector need to be aware of. Now, you can sort of help by sort of demonstrating that pesticide use is being done in the most sort of safe and sustainable and responsible sort of fashion. And if you get the chance, go on and sort of engage with sort of folks who may have some concerns on that front. It's events like this give you some of the knowledge and expertise that enable you to have an informed debate with folks. Society in general is probably a bit more sort of risk averse than it was in the past. It probably explains some of the reasons for the sort of move towards a system that's certainly more sort of receptive to this sort of lobbying. It's also the difficulty of explaining the difference between hazard and risk, something which may be familiar to many of us in this room, but probably the general public sort of struggle to understand those sorts of concepts. So there is sort of societal sort of pressures behind this sort of move, perhaps towards a slightly more sort of a regime that leans more towards the sort of political than the science. Next area is then the sort of the environmental sort of sphere, and I mentioned earlier that sort of DEFRA hold policy responsibilities, certainly here in England, for pesticides. It's, as the slide says, a very sort of data-rich environment. In some respects, there's almost sort of too much sort of data out there. How do you separate the good data from the bad data in order to determine what the key facts are and how that should influence the decision-making process? DEFRA have published the 25-year environment plan. Pesticides get a mention in a couple of places. Pesticides in water, of course, they're seen as something that has the ability to impact negatively on water quality. The standards for pesticides in water are incredibly tough. Very low sort of standards of, you might want to sort of term sort of pollution or sort of residues in pesticides in water being tolerated under the water legislation. And I think you do need to understand as well that even if you use a pesticide in accordance with its authorised conditions of use set by us as HSE, there's a possibility it could turn up in water at levels that are going to cause concern for those who look after water quality. So again, sort of working with the Amenity Forum, you could get an understanding of sort of situations where it may be more risky to apply a sort of pesticide in a certain situation, to a big sort of hard surface where there's a threat of sort of heavy rainfall immediately sort of afterwards. It's these sorts of things that we hope through events such as this, folks will get an understanding of and can use pesticides in a more sort of judicious manner in the future. There's reference on this slide here to possibly a more sort of interventionist approach. And I was saying earlier that sort of government policy is essentially being sort of give industry sort of first crack at any sort of problems which emerge. And we've seen that in the agricultural sphere where an active substance known as metaldehyde, which is used in slug pellets, was turning up in drinking water supplies at sort of levels which were causing headache, not only for the water companies, but also also government. So we gave the agricultural industry best part of a sort of decade to introduce a series of product stewardship approaches to reduce the levels of metaldehyde in water. And that did have a positive impact. It just didn't go sort of far enough for the government to deliver the sorts of standards that are required under water quality legislation. So there's suggestions sort of emerging from this that the government might favour a more sort of interventionist approach. It might move a bit more sort of quickly in the future, might not give industry 10 years to sort of crack a problem, might look at some sort of alternative solution, introducing some legislation, either using water quality legislation or using pesticide legislation to address some of these issues. It's only a suggestion. I'm not saying it's actually going to happen, but that may be sort of reflected in any sort of new version of the National Action Plan, new approaches to pesticide regulations. So I think the key message for you guys here is, do you sort of understand the riskier situations when it comes to application of sort of pesticides, and when it may move to water to a degree sort of greater than we would all like to sort of see. And again, lots of useful sort of guidance from the Amenity Forum to help you there. Promise to sort of return to sort of integrated approaches, which is sort of the final point on the environmental side. Integrated pest management is essentially, not putting all your eggs in the sort of the chemical basket. It's really sort of recognising that there are a range of sort of products or techniques or sort of mechanisms out there that you can use to control pests, weeds and diseases. And it's kind of sort of built around sort of 4 principles. Firstly, you've got the sort of the cultural sort of approach. And in the amenity situation, that might be sort of designing sort of landscapes in such a way that doesn't encourage weeds to develop. Second stage is then sort of monitoring the levels of sort of weeds that are emerging, and considering to intervene to control them whichever way you choose, only when sort of certain thresholds have been reached. So, do you want to destroy every weed that emerges, and are you looking at complete eradication in all cases, or can you live with a lesser degree of control? As I'm thinking very carefully about the sort of form of control that's sort of used, do you automatically reach for the chemical can each time, or are there alternatives that may be able to do the job to a suitable degree? And the final sort of principle there on integrated pest management is actually sort of recording the outcomes of what you've done. Has the chosen method of control delivered the goal that was sought? And so I think there's a very sort of big push, and there's a great sort of interest at sort of ministerial level on making integrated pest management happen to a far greater degree than it is at the moment. So again, a sort of question for you guys, sort of folks that work for you, has there been sort of sufficient consideration given to the range of pest, weed and disease controls that are out there? On the technical and sort of economic stuff, this follows on a bit from the integrated pest management, in that we're starting to see the emergence of sort of new technologies. It's not just sort of chemicals that are there. We have the hot waters, the hot foams, the electric sort of weedings, and that's, well, I sort of stood here sort of 10 years ago mentioning these things to gatherings such as this, and quite rightly there was some sort of scepticism as to whether that was the time for these sorts of new technologies. But the world sort of moved on. There's sort of indications that those that require, for example, sort of weed control are more sort of receptive to contractors or those they employ to do their work, looking at these sorts of alternatives. Now, they're not necessarily as environmentally benign as might initially sort of appear. There are definitely sort of cost implications of using these alternatives compared to a purely sort of chemical approach. But there are sort of people out there who are prepared to consider the use of these alternatives, even despite the fact that there are sort of costs and benefits associated with their use. I think for those of you that sort of operate in the sector, you could sort of view it as an opportunity. If you can become sort of familiar with these new types of machinery, find the most sort of efficient ways of operating them, does help to sort of reduce the cost gap that exists there at the moment, and might put you in a better position to meet the needs of sort of customers who are more inclined to this sort of pest, weed and disease control. So it's there as an option, and it's something that we might expect to sort of see develop in the future. Then of course we've got sort of EU exit sitting at the back of the whole thing. I said at the beginning, may not be as sort of influential as some of these other things. We really don't know. I mean, in the short term, It's pretty simple. Government's committed to effectively cutting and pasting existing sort of European legislation and sort of taking that forward. Now, clearly, there will be the opportunity to diverge in the future. We just don't know which direction that might take. Is that a direction that's perhaps had a sort of less precautionary approach to sort of pesticide sort of regulation? Does it adopt some of the sort of practices you see in other sort of European countries where, for example, they sort of prohibit pesticide use in amenity sort of situation? Or does it continue sort of down the middle? We just don't know, but it's that opportunity for divergence in the future that you need to be aware of. And something, again, you've got the possibility of influencing by sort of showing the sort of professional sort of practices that you as a sector can operate. And I say, having lots of tools at your disposal to deliver what your customers want would seem to be a very sort of sensible sort of approach and way to plan for the future. Because I think one of the key sort of messages here is that sort of pesticides are under sort of pressure. I say this sort of regulatory regime that has been established at European level has been very successful in removing lots of some of the older sort of chemistry from the market, but there's a fear it's actually sort of going too far in some cases and removing some products that you may feel can be used sort of perfectly safely. So years ago there was about 1,000 sort of active substances approved at European level. We're down to around about sort of 250, 300. So you can see there's been a sort of massive cull on sort of the chemistry that's available to folks, and this may be sort of driving some of these, some of the sort of the newer technologies that are coming through. So I'll just wrap up by saying sort of change is coming. I say that will be sort of reflected in this sort of new version of the National Action Plan. There's a fair degree of sort of uncertainty as to sort of the nature of that change in the direction that it might take. But I think by engaging with events such as this, being sort of members of the forum, it puts sort of you guys, whatever your sort of role is in the sector and however you're sort of affected by pesticides, puts you in a good position to understand what that might be and to plan for the future. And I think with that, John, I'll wrap up.
Thank you very much, Grant. Thank you.